the discussion that we're going to have this evening tends to go one way or the other, right? Depending on who is talking. But even though I have my position on some of the issues we'll be discussing and reasons for them, of course, I believe when it comes to the question of Christianity and whether someone can be, who claims to be a Christian, can also be lesbian, gay, which is often used for male homosexuals. So you have lesbians and gays, male, female homosexuals who tend to have relationships with their own, we'll say, biological gender, right? Because you have gender identity things now. And I'm not going to get into that so much this evening, although you also have, as part of the LGBTQ acronym, and I realize that there's more, but if I add the plus, then it's going to include us. And I'm not really talking about whether heterosexuals can be Christians. That's never really questioned, is it? Because that's just the way the Bible presents humankind as being made by God as heterosexual. Now, there are other issues that exist in the history of God's people or the people of the earth as described by the Bible and other records, right, where you have different times where even though it's heterosexual, it's polygamous, or there can be more than one woman for one man. I've done a video on it. It's not something that as Christians, we believe, Christian witnesses of Jah in this case, is essential to have complete agreement on because we follow the laws of the land. So our interpretation of, even though it's very clear, right, that in the Old Testament, many people of faith and servants of God had more than one woman. Women are described in the opening account as being made in man's image to help man, as an assistant. And it's literally how the Hebrew text, and consistent with the Greek, reads. There's some variation in meaning, but basically the same. That is, that woman is there to work with man and together praise God, make the earth a beautiful place, fill it with other images of God, human beings doing the same thing. There's really no provision in the Bible for a homosexual, whether that's lesbian, sometimes I'll abbreviate that as lesbo, same with homosexual, homo, heterosexual, hetero. But in terms of the acronym LGBTQ, right? So lesbian, there's no real provisions for living as a lesbian couple in the Bible, Old or New Testament. Maybe you can argue some things in the New Testament, but it's, as we're going to see in a moment, and this is very important, all of you who are LGBTQ, whether you claim to be Christian or not, I'm going to deal with mostly, if not exclusively, one text from the Bible. By text, I mean one section, one grouping of verses that everybody is familiar with on this issue. But I think both heterosexuals and LGBTQ people will see something possibly you didn't see before or think of before. That's really the right way I should put it. Maybe you have. We'll find out. But I think really, while we don't just use one text usually, right? There are texts where, of course, we can use them exclusively to build the doctrine, right? One God the Father. But that's consistent with everything else, right? And it's not the only text that says that either. However, other texts wouldn't contradict that, would they? So in the same way, I don't think we need to always go and look at every text. And that my objective tonight is not really to do that. I don't think we need to. If I thought we needed to, right, to really hammer home the clear doctrine of the text, right, like on some issues we do. So why not homosexuality? Well, because a lot of the texts that if I were going to read them all, they're basically saying the same thing. Don't do it, right? And in the Old Testament, of course, we have a much harsher penalty, and so LGBTQ people often, in my experience and in talking with them, and I've talked with them most of my life, they find that the way that the Bible describes, in the Old Testament in particular, I'm talking now, talks about, putting to death homosexuals, basically, is, this is one reason why Christianity and biblical Judaism, the Bible, LGBTQ people, I'm not including the plus because that could include us, and I want to make it clear that I'm talking. This isn't a question of heteros, because there isn't a question of heteros being Christians, because even LGBTQ people, they don't question whether heterosexuals are Christian, whether you can practice heterosexuality as described in the Bible and be Christian. The Bible doesn't describe practicing homosexuality and remaining a Christian or an approved Jew. Now, of course, homosexuals, LGBTQ people at times will say, well, there are accounts in the Bible where you have homosexual behavior, like David and Jonathan. But that account does not say they had a sexual relationship, or any of the accounts in the Bible. And if they had, that would have, of course, incurred the very penalty I just mentioned ago that we also know is in the Bible. That, like later when David was king and he violated the law, he was subject to death, although the question was whether to keep him or to kill the child, because David was chosen in the line of succession in a way that Jah was still using. So the choice was up to him, right? And so that's for Jah to decide. If he wants to preserve alive David, even though he committed a great sin, and take the life of the child, the sin has to be atoned for in that instance. Well, they're under the law and under conditions that, similar to the prohibitions and penalties of death for homosexuality, LGBTQ people, were to protect the line of the Messiah, to prepare the body that is spoken about in the Old and New Testaments as being fulfilled in the coming of Jesus. So often what is lost, I find, in almost every instance until I bring it up with homosexuals. By the way, good to see Betsy and John alive. Yes, Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, we'll get to that, right? I don't think there's any question, really, that the Bible speaks against homosexuality, right? No, homos will say, well, there's, again, like I said before, but homos, the Jonathan and David account doesn't really get into a sexual element. The Bible in the book of Proverbs talks about how you can be a friend who is closer than a brother. That's in Proverbs 18:24. Right? There exists a friend sticking closer than a brother. So that seems more like Jonathan and David to me, not this homosexuality that you all often want to read into those accounts, just because it says that they loved each other, right? And it's very expressive in ways. But again, as Proverbs 18 states clearly, you can be closer than a brother, right? Where you have clear love, you grow up together, you often embrace, and you have very intimate moments. You can be closer than that as a friend. And absent any explicit homosexuality, I don't see how you can credibly get to that in those accounts. It's not in there. It doesn't say that. And there's a viable explanation that I just read to you that's consistent with what they would have been responsible for under the law and were not punished for if it were the case, because obviously people knew about it, right? It's part of the biblical record, the relationship that they had. So if that was the type that they had, then the punishment would have been provided, even if Jah would have done something similar to what he did with his and Bathsheba's child, right? Because he could have still kept David alive and punished Jonathan, or done something else in a way that would have expressed his anger and satisfied the atonement of their sin under the law, but still kept David alive, or his purpose. Totally, and David still died. Jehovah can do whatever he wants. And so if that's what he chooses to do, and keep someone alive and punish something and some relationship to that individual, and then ultimately that person too, well, then that's what's going to happen. He's well within his rights to do that, or anything else that he wants to do. Someone else is free to argue differently now or later in the chat or comments if you think otherwise. But I don't see how you can do so and claim that God would not be able to act in the way that would be best in terms of bringing about his purpose while he's dealing with people who have committed sins, justifying death in terms of the wages that sin pays, not the reward that God chooses to give or not give at the judgment. This is what a lot of people are not understanding relative to the Watchtower. The Watchtower's understanding, and all kinds of other people who don't believe in the Bible are completely collapsing because they can't figure out something so simple as the difference between what the wages of sin are and what the reward from God is, whether he chooses to give it to you or not. Seems very clear in the Bible. I did a whole video on it. First and second death, first and second resurrection, and other related videos that you'll see in the description to that video, where I talked about what the Bible discusses in John 5, Revelation 20, and in other texts. So it's important that we properly understand these texts, right? We have a lot of misinformation out there. We have a lot of discussion that's confusing to people. And I want to try to keep this as focused as possible on this question. I'm just giving you examples of how we need to be careful in our thinking and not allow ourselves to be moved so quickly from one position to another, whether it's this teaching or that teaching. When it comes to homosexuality, let me ask you heteros first. Do any heteros out there? Good to see you, George. Again, whether now in the chat or later, right? You may not be here, but regardless, if you would like to respond and you're heterosexual, right? You're not bisexual, right? We've been kind of breaking down the acronym LGBTQ that we're addressing in terms of this issue, because I think it covers most everything. The lesbian, right? Female homos, gay, primarily male homos. Although I mostly use homo for gays, but gay and homo can be both lesbians and male homos. So male homos don't really have like their own specific term that I'm aware of. I mean, they may, and I'm just not aware of it, but that's why I come up with other terms. Some are not always pleasant for some homos, I'm sure, right? Like, again, I've mentioned before that in Roman times, during, for example, the first century, they were known as analists. Right? And Nero would even go around with his group of bodyguards dressed as a woman and rape people. Anally raped them. I'm not saying all homos are like that. Right? There are a lot of crazy heteros, too, that would do something similar. But Nero was nuts, and so I want to mention him. And he's discussed in the same volume, I believe, and where this issue of the analyst comes up in Tacitus. So, but even then, right, again, lesbians could be involved in anal sex. They could just be using a strap-on, an artificial male organ, or just interplaying with other male homos or heteros, and they're still lesbian, right? It could be bisexual, or, a lot of homosexuals I've known, whether male or female, they're not all, even the ones I would say are lesbian or gay, male, homo, they're not all like totally that way. They're open to maybe not as much as bisexual. Bisexual, when people say that, it's more like either way, it's kind of even, more or less. But I don't, in my experience, the people I've known, homosexuals, male and female, they're not like against any form of hetero, that is male and female, sex. Now, I'm not going to get into all the genders, LGBTQ people out there tonight. I understand there's a lot of different issues, right? We'll talk about this another time, this whole gender identity. Now, with transgender, right, in terms of the LGBTQ acronym, that is part of the issue, because transgender really means you don't identify with the gender assigned to you at your birth, right? Basically your physiology. The cisgender label is for people who do identify with our at birth physiology, right? Basically, if you have a penis, you're a male, right? There's like very few, very rare exceptions, like this mutations that might not be definable on a gender physiological level, but that is not a common aspect of the human reproductive cycle, so much so that it becomes an actual category meant to be reproduced. I couldn't even give you any examples. I've just heard, and I think I've seen footage of people who've claimed that, you know, they don't actually have a biological gender. So I guess it's possible, but that's not normative. We don't use extreme exceptions to define what's normative. The fact that they're very rare shows they're not normative. So what we have as normative is pretty clear, right? From the Bible, Old and New Testament, to modern times, right? We can see that the biological gender that we're assigned at birth is based on certain characteristics of our anatomy, right? Do we have a vagina? Do we have a penis? Do we have breasts? Right? And there are other features, of course, that develop in association with being either male or female biologically. And there can be some differences, right? We know there can be some feminine males and there can be some masculine females. They still have the physiology or anatomy of their biological gender, but they either seem more like the other gender, biologically speaking, or they now, or and in times past, identify as that gender and may seem as that way as well. But either way, this issue of identity comes into play. And so transgender people are those who identify differently from their biology. And they will also at times, of course, go through gender reassignment surgery because of that identity difference. And so people like most heteros, you and me, if you're a hetero like me, right, you prefer sex with the other gender. We'll get into some of these other questions of desire and stuff later, but basically that's what you practice. That's what you don't have sex with both males and females. You don't have sex with your own gender, biologically speaking now. So again, I kind of covered the transgender. We talked about lesbian, gay, primarily male homos, although it could also apply to female homos. But I'll try to be specific tonight. So we talked about the analists, right, from the Roman times, but that's still not specific enough because females could participate in that act too, and even so-called heteros, right? You could have people who identify, and I talked about this in my We Need to Talk About This Homos video, that there are some heteros who do practice anal. Now, I say they're heteros because it's biological male and female, but the biological male and is anally having anal intercourse with the female, and she's in this scenario case willing. Right, we're not talking about unwilling relationships here. So, what's the difference, right? Lesbians or gays could, in my opinion, rightly say, well, what's the difference, right? Well, if you're having anal intercourse with a woman, you're a man, and you're having anal intercourse with a woman, her rectum, her anus. Why are you so opposed to two males having sex that way? Right? It's an anus. They're both anuses in the female and in the male. The only difference is that one's a biological female, one's a biological male. But in our biology as females and males, the anus is common. And it does the same thing, right? It excretes toxic waste. And I've talked about the anatomy before, and anyone can find it online. It's something everybody really should know, but that I think, as I talked about my last video about this subject, we need to talk about this homos, it's not openly discussed the way I talked about in that video, or as I'm going to do tonight, the way it needs to be, the way it really is, right? So if I refer to homos, male homos, as anal rupturing homos, right? That's mostly going to be male homos, right? Homos, males, and females may say, what do you mean anal rupturing? Well, okay. Yeah, it could also be the heteros who, in my opinion, would be abusive, but also really not doing much different than what you're doing. And so, in my opinion, essentially, they're like at, right? They're like at the base of Brokeback Mountain. Okay, they're about ready to climb the mountain, if they haven't already. If you're doing anal, right? And this is what a lot of you are going to find, and I'm going to talk about in a separate video in about 2 weeks, a video where I'm going to talk about fornication, porneia, right? Pornos, another word many of you probably aren't familiar with, but we're going to see it tonight. These words aren't what you guys, I think, guys, girls, everybody. Sometimes it's a general reference, right, guys? It's not meant to be gender specific, but those words, I don't think many people understand, excuse me, what those words really mean. And I will talk about it a little tonight, but I'm going to do a whole show on it because I think it's very important. I've already talked about adultery a little bit in my polygamy video. I'll get to it a little bit more in the next show about porneia and pornos. But I wanted to mention that here because those terms involve anal, right? Porneia basically means, as I'm going to show later, prostitution. It is primarily used of what happens in a whorehouse, or what we refer to as a whorehouse or brothel, or whatever you want to call it, right? They're more refined today. I understand that. They're not like labeled that way or usually depicted in that way. But historically, and of course, ancient times, right? They weren't, well, I'm sure they had some high-class establishments and stuff, right? You can see in places like Pompeii and other places where, they're just locations where these acts were performed, a lot of graffiti and things that would be very clear in marking what happens there, right? And it included everything, right? Pedophilia, anal, homo, all of it. Any type of abusive, unusual sex is what those terms refer to. Pornos, so pornos, as you're going to see later, as you'll find if you research it, I'll talk about more in that video, it's very specifically used of sodomites, catamites, and other forms of sexual abuse. And I've done videos on sodomy. They're linked in the description below, which basically, again, is consistent with porneia, sexual abuse, which includes anal. Okay, and I've talked about this in several videos, as I just mentioned, and that are linked below. And I don't think there's really any question, right? If you're a homo, lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, queer, right? Queer is basically the same thing. Mostly male homosexual, but just homosexual is my understanding of it. Something other than a heterosexual, for sure. LGBTQ. So we're looking at this issue, right? These different, what the acronym represents essentially, and asking the question, can Christians fit into any of those categories? Can you be a lesbian? Can you be gay? Can you be a Christian and be gay, a male homosexual? Can you be a Christian and be a bisexual, where you have sexual relations, right? We're not talking right now. I'm going to get to this in just a minute, right? Desire, whether you feel like doing something is different than actually doing it. Now, there's a sense in which we're all going to be judged for our thoughts anyway, right? Because the Spirit of God knows all things, and that way our spirit is from the Father, goes back to Him when we die. I'm pretty sure if our technology is the way it is today, they can read our spirit just right and find out everything. And we don't even realize it, right? Either way, when we get into this question, right, we want to ask ourselves whether or not we have biblical evidence to say whether Christians can be lesbian, gay, meaning male homo in that case, bisexual, both hetero and homo, transgender, right? Can you be a Christian and identify as a gender different than the one you were biologically assigned at birth? And as a Christian, can you be queer, which is essentially the same thing as homo? There, as far as I'm aware, and homos, or queers, anyone is free to correct me out there, and hopefully you have some reference or source. But if you want to just put down your thoughts and opinions, I'll check it later, and if it's something serious, then I'll correct it or pin a notice. But I'm pretty sure that what I've stated regarding the LGBTQ acronym is correct in large part, if not entirely. And so I'm not going to get into the gender identity issue beyond what I've just discussed to kind of bring us into this issue further, other than for trans. Okay? I mean, I guess it's good. A lot of what we're going to talk about will apply, but I'm not so sure. Well, we'll get into it more later, but I think there might be another issue there, right? I've talked about how the Homo Act, the physical act of anal sex involving males or females, using artificial or just participating with another male, hetero or homo, and how heteros who also practice anal are essentially, this is all porneia, right? This is all sexual abuse that's, in my view, and as I'm going to define further later and a little bit later tonight, but I don't want to get too far off the issue that is, I think, more easy to answer. Can you be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer, and Christian? Right? You might, again, desire these things. This is where we're going to go next. What the Bible actually says, and then what it means in terms of like other sins, right? We often look at some of these texts and think, well, it very clearly says, right, no homo, basically. But it also says no to a lot of other things, right? A lot of other things that most of us do, right? If most of us maybe don't fall into the homo category of sin, right? Maybe a lot of us aren't idolaters either, but some of us, if not a lot of us, are greedy. Okay. Well, does that mean you can never be greedy? What about that? Does it mean you can never feel greedy? Let's say you never act greedily. We'll get to the text in a minute, but it's in there, right? And I think most of us already know 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Before we go and read that in the surrounding context, think about this, right? I want you to have a little bit of pre-thought going into the text so that when we read it, you're already sort of aware of where I'm going to go next and why it's important that we have this discussion. It's important not only because of, like I talked about in my We Need to Talk About This Homos video, we need to be open. My main concern with LGBTQ people, whether you claim to be Christian or not, is whether you are being honest with what you do, what it does, what it involves. Are LGBTQ people being honest like we are right now, talking about it openly and making it clear to people that this is what's going to happen? Some of these types of conditions, right? Yeah, you'll also have benefits, right? The LGBTQ community is very active, very welcoming. There's many nice people, right? This has nothing to do with personalities and issues of whether or not you can trust someone with your wallet. It's a question of morality, right? It's a question of activity. It's a question of Christianity in this case. And it's not just those homos who claim to be LGBTQ, who claim to be Christian, who I think this affects, but right, because I think that would all answering this question would also be relevant to them. I think the answer is critical for everybody because Christians, whereas homosexuals, LGBTQ people, in my opinion, are not being as open, not as transparent, not as with people. Why? the great irony, I believe that it's homophobia. It's LGBTQ phobia. Or it's just anal phobia or sexual abuse phobia. The problem, LGBTQs, is I think you all are more afraid than you are willing to admit to talk about these issues. Right? Talking about anal sex and its effects, right? You put more than a pinky in your anus, anyone's anus, it's going to tear. It's that thin down there. It works with excreting toxic human waste because that's how it's designed muscularly and with the specific types of lubricants for that material, not for a sexual reproductive act or even the type of sex act that may not always lead to reproduction, but that does if done at the right time, right? It's clearly designed differently, like I talked about in my last video, and like everybody knows. And so we get into this question of whether homos, LGBTQ people are going to be honest with our children, with other people, right? Because if someone really doesn't have that desire in a way that maybe they would need to be around LGBTQ people in a way to feel more comfortable, right? There are people who just identify or are lesbian, homosexual, gay, transgender, bisexual, queer. And whether they, and this is very key to what we're going to talk about soon, whether they believe it's right, and sometimes not believing it's right can lead people to commit suicide. So it's a fine line here and has to be handled very well. And that's why, and another reason why I think this is so important, it's important that we explain and have a position as Christians so that LGBTQ people and heterosexual people who claim to be Christian can work together or we can't, right? And I believe the answer is staring us right in the face. But like often happens, we become frightened of what we don't practice or what we don't think is right. And it divides us before we're able to understand what's happening and why. Let me explain. Remember earlier when I was talking about greed? Let's go to the text. Let's go ahead and go to the text, right? And if you're in the chat, like I see one individual that we had to remove. Anytime anyone tells you how you feel, like, oh, you don't love me, or you're hateful, or anytime anyone says you're not really, qualified to address this issue, and you don't even know them and they don't know you, and they don't take issue with anything you've said, they're just saying something because that's all they can do, immediately ignore that person. Anyone who has anything worthwhile to say will never tell you how you feel, because you cannot do that. Nobody can tell you how you feel. You might be totally acting, right? Even if you're acting hateful, how do you know someone's really being hateful? Right? Sometimes homosexuals act very hateful toward me, but I don't really look at them that way. They act that way, but I kind of look beyond. I try to look beyond that. I'm sure the Father, Jah, does that better than me. So it's very important that we never assume, right? We could barely even figure out ourselves, so knock it off, right? Anytime anyone tells you how you feel, immediately tell them, no, you don't, and there's no way you can, so it's time for me to go. I don't talk to people who tell me things they couldn't possibly know. It's ridiculous. It suggests you're a narcissist who's emotionally arrested and underdeveloped. So you're projecting how you feel on other people and telling them how they feel, which is not something you're capable of doing. So what else could you be doing? You're telling everybody how you feel. And that's not something a rational person can engage with. You can't win that discussion. So it's immediately over at that point, everybody. Whether you're a homosexual or heterosexual or LGBTQ, I guess in this case plus. Anytime anyone does that, you know immediately you're dealing with an emotionally underdeveloped individual who's likely projecting, and you won't be able to rationally converse with them. Right? It's not just the Trinitarian apologetic nuts that are at times, wasted, right? There's no point in going, right? Like Sam Shamoon, right? Although he's kind of in a special category. He's been handed over. So I wouldn't even put him anymore. But for a long time, right, the Trinitarian apologetic nuts were sanctioning and even using Sam, right? That's how low they sunk to try to do anything, right? That shows you that they were pretty much done. Right? If you're using Sam Shamoon, you're done, right? And that, of course, proved to be the case, or at least they're done with him. One way or the other, you're done. Bad move. But either way, it's not just the Trinitarian apologetic nuts who go nuts, right? We have LGBTQ plus nuts, right? And that includes heteros, right? We have heterosexual nuts, people who, right, like really, in this case, claim to be maybe Christian. And now I'd be thinking more like the people who bomb abortion clinics and who go break the law in order to try to do what they think is right. In ways that, they try to justify, but they ultimately condemn themselves by their actions. And so, right, that's going nuts as a quote unquote Christian, right? We wouldn't accept that as appropriate behavior. Or, even, mass demonstrations, right, against a way of life, I don't see any precedent for that in the Bible anywhere. And they seem to do more harm than good and inflame people in a negative way towards everybody. Right? But just like I said, the way do you consider Sam Shamoon, right? Even before he was rejected by the Trinitarians, at least on the Protestant side. Who knows what the Catholics have done, right? Beware. Either way, right? You don't consider him representative of all Trinitarians, do you? LGBTQ plus people? You don't know who Sam Shamoon is, right? He's basically a blasphemous person who pretends to be, in my opinion, a Christian. And even those who he most closely identifies with, or used to, have rejected him because of his antics. A couple videos about him on the channel, right? He's definitely a spectacle. And possibly demonized, as I try to evaluate in one of my videos. So we don't use him, right, as a normative example. If I talk to Sam, you're not thinking that's how Trinitarians all are you? Of course not. And even some of the hardcore apologists, although most of them are fairly nice, right? I wouldn't put any of the people like Dr. White, Bowman, or even Maury, right? Maury's probably the closest type, but Sam's not in any of those categories. He's very much off the deep end. So we have to know who we're talking to also. If I, like I said earlier, say anal rupturing homos, my being, maybe that's not the kindest thing to say, I guess. Am I wrong? Am I wrong if I'm referring to male homosexuals as anal rupturers? Is that factually incorrect? Well, I talked about earlier, right? If you stick so much as more than a pinky, that's how sensitive and thin your anal cell wall is. And when you have sex with it, right, it tears almost immediately, right? That's why they have to have proctologists on the sets of these porno shoots. You can look it up, right? You're going to look into anal and the effects and the damages. All this stuff is going to come up. You're going to see stories about things. It gets worse. I'm going to try to keep it, just basic here and not get too graphic, but it gets worse. Okay, so this is not just some minor thing. There is massive damage that happens. I had a commenter on my last video. We need to talk about This Homos. Carol. Hi, Carol. I had posted, I had some problems with some of my responses on the comment section of that video. And either way, I had posted a link to an article Carol had asked about monkeypox and whether it was something more prevalent in the LGBTQ community or the gay community. And I sent back a link, but it didn't show up. It wasn't even in my held for review thing. So I don't know what happened. I think some things are just too sensitive and YouTube does its own thing. It's the only thing I can figure out. But it basically says, as you can find, and Carol, I'll send it to you later, or I'll pin it to the video in this, the comments to this video or the other video that you commented on, where the issue with the monkeypox in large part involves the things like lesions, right? When you're having, like we were just talking about, when you get involved in the anal intercourse, the rupturing occurs. It's a fact. It's gonna happen. You're gonna have to be stitched up, literally. or it will become a problem, right? Sometimes they have to do worse, like I said. Sometimes part of the rectal or the rear end area comes out. And they got to put it back. Either way, when you're stitched up, you need to heal. And even when you heal, the second you have anal sex again, you're going to tear. And then you're ultimately going to be re-tearing many of the same areas that have been tearing, which creates lesions, which makes it more easy to transmit disease like monkeypox. Okay, so and you have things like anal warts, right? I don't talk about everything because I don't think I need to, right? I had a very nice person comment on my last video, and we wanted to know why focus so much on the anal part of the question, homos, the gay lifestyle and stuff. And I just said, it's the easiest thing to bring up and try to resolve because it's so obvious that it involves extensive damage and exposure to deadly disease and death itself, right? From the anal tearing and the mixing of fluids and the ejaculation that comes from the sexual intercourse with the anus. If you ejaculate, right, you may use a condom. Hopefully homos, you're doing that. But condoms can break and not everyone uses them. It's not the most convenient thing because everybody knows who's had intercourse. So if you as homos ejaculate into each other's anal area, you are going to immunosuppress each other. In addition to the risks that are involved with the anal tearing and all the other stuff that I mentioned. So there's really no question, right? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that the damages are severe. Now, whether that's abuse and whether that qualifies you to be a Christian or not, we're going to get to that in a moment. But this is what I meant earlier when I said, look, are you homos? Are you LGBTQ people being honest, at least about the most obvious aspect of what us heteros think of when and what is in fact most often involved in bisexual, homo, or gay male relationships, and at times female, whether it's part of a bisexual or a female artificial interplay. It's still anal abuse. So, in terms of the effects, right? All right, okay, so I think that's pretty clear. I don't think many or most homos would argue that it's physically abusive to engage in the most, we'll say, predominant form of male homosexuality. Also, though, very much a part of bisexuality and even heterosexuality, meaning biological male and females who do anal. But I think, I'm not seeing a whole lot of difference. There's a little difference there. It is a female, but whether it's a male or a female, it's the anus, right? There's a difference. It's a man's anus versus a female's anus, but it's still an anus. The effects are the same, okay? Whereas the female has a vagina, male does not. And so the female has what is appropriately fitting for the male penis that nobody questions, okay? It's very clear and obvious in so many ways. I encourage you to look at it because the detail is incredible. It really is. Like all parts of our bodies, but those two go together, you see. So it's very unique in that way. Whereas with the anus, this is not happening, right? Even with two female homos, right? The lesbian part of LGBTQ, it's not happening, right? You can have two females, whether they have a strap on or not, if they're scissoring and they're just stimulating each other superficially, whether they're using an interpenetrating device or not, it's not a male penis. It's not a male body. It's not a male mind. It's not male thought. It's not love. There's no way that's love. It may be passion, maybe pleasure, and maybe you love that person as a person, but the act is not giving that person, even in a female on female sexual intercourse type scenario, you're not giving each other what you need based on how you are designed, that we can easily see is provided by the other member to your species, right? It's not like it's hard to find what you need and what you're designed for, what we need and what we're designed for, with no abuse, right? There's no abuse in the normal hetero act, LGBTQ people. None. Done appropriately and done with love, there's no damage that happens. Yeah, if you start having unsafe relationships, or you again do the anal abuse or stuff, it can become abusive, of course. It's not what I'm talking about. The Bible doesn't talk about anything other than normal sex in the way, when I say normal, how we're biologically made, right? The anus is not biologically designed or evolved for any kind of sex act. So it has a very clear function. It gets damaged if it's used otherwise, and the damages are severe. Not performing the sex act right has an effect on the reproduction of the species. It's very clear that among the LGBTQ community, there is an increase, for example, among male homos, of meth usage by, among some studies, 4-1. Okay, there are higher suicide rates among homosexuals than heterosexuals. And there may be various reasons, but the fact is, again, this is not something it's not creating a child, neither lesbians nor gays. Bisexuals can, and I think, even like I said earlier, you can probably create a reproductive community and cycle, as lesbians and gay homos, right? If you just agreed to work together, right? You're still gay, you're still male homos, but you work with the lesbians to create a community of children. You could still survive. But so I'm really dealing with, when I talk about this issue from a critical perspective, or when I ask the question of whether LGBTQ people can be Christians or Christians can be LGBTQ people, I'm talking about the abuse. I'm talking about, you guys say you're showing love, and you're saying we're being hateful, when we're just, at least in my case, I've been called hateful for telling you the truth. You know what that sounds like? Homos? Or the LGBTQ people who think I'm hateful when I say the truth? That the male homo anal act is an anal rupturing act? It sounds like the Jews who, when Jesus told them the truth, called him names. So we all agree sometimes the truth hurts, right? So why am I being hateful if I'm just telling you the truth and it hurts? Are you sure it's not that? Are you sure I'm being hateful? Are you sure you know how I feel? Are you sure what I'm saying isn't real? Maybe it's just hurting because it's true. We all have to go through that. But it's more important that you're truthful and honest with yourself if you're going to do the homo act. And I'm going to show you that right now. And I'm going to show you why, in my understanding of what the Bible teaches, in this case, the New Testament, because we're talking about being a Christian, right? We already talked about the Old Testament, summarized it, right? I'm not going to get into text after text after text. We don't need to do that. We can at times, but, and if you have any specific questions, we can talk about it. But we've discussed Jonathan and David, how there's no evidence of any homo, how it's consistent with Proverbs 18, sticking closer than a brother, friends sticking closer than a brother, how they would have been put to death under the law that provided that punishment for homos, how that punishment, like other punishments for other sins, was meant to protect the Messiah's line so that God could prepare a body. With Michael the archangel, as I've talked about in other videos, right? The Prince of Israel, the angel of Jehovah, overseeing this whole process, right? The Lord that David said Jehovah spoke to in Psalm 110:1, right? How do you hear that, right? Because David didn't ascend to the heavens, according to Acts 2. So I believe he heard that conversation with the Prince of Israel and Jehovah. Either way, the point is, they weren't messing around, right? This was about salvation. The whole earth was put onto a death cycle by our choices, by responding to someone else's influence and desiring something and then acting on it, right? Would it have been a violation on the part of Adam and Eve at the point where she looked at the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Remember, the account says that it looked desirous, right? It looked like something she wanted. Did she sin at that point? Did Eve sin at the point where she looked and she saw that the tree was good to eat? In fact, we'll go to it real quick. Genesis chapter 3. Let me bring you all up here. Genesis 3:6. Consequently, the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was something to be longed for to the eyes. Yes, the tree was desirable to look upon. Did Eve sin at this point right here? Or was the sin right here? This is laying the foundation for my view and understanding of the issue we're discussing this evening. Can Christians be LGBTQ? Because I think this pretty much can apply to everything. Remember, we talked about, and we're going to get back to in just a moment, what it means to be greedy, how you can feel greedy. You can want something, you can covet something, right? You can desire something, but not take it. Is that a sin? Well, we also know, again, as Jesus said, if you think about things like porneia, or if you desire someone's wife, right, then you're committing a sin in your heart. But we also know that we receive forgiveness through his name. So we just know that the way we were meant to be is what he's saying, right, is so much more than even what the law prescribed. And so actually showing how merciful it was, especially given the fact that they were preparing the Messiah's body, right, the one who was going through all this to make it right. That's why they were so serious about it. Same with Adam, right? Afterwards, she gave some also to her husband, right? So when Eve came up to Adam and he saw the fruit, maybe even when he held it, had he sinned at that point? Or was it after he had eaten from it? The text says that she gave it to him and he began eating it. This account makes it clear, as I believe you'll see everywhere, other than in the text I just referenced, the one where we all know Jesus says if you so much as look at someone, right? But he didn't lay that down. He didn't say you'd be. That's not the unforgivable sin, is it? Does it describe thinking of a woman in your heart in a sexual way as the unforgivable sin, whether you're married or not? Is adultery the unforgivable sin? Is porneia the unforgivable sin? Porneia, which, as I'm going to argue a little bit later, and also more so in a separate show, because I don't think we need to get deep into it for this video, but for another video we will, which includes anal. It includes pedo, porneia, pornos. All of these things are sins that people commit after thinking about it, right? I mean, I can't think of an example where, excuse me, I can't think of an example where somebody doesn't, even at least for a split second, think about the sin before committing it. You're conscious at all. I don't see how you couldn't have some moment of thought where you haven't sinned yet, right? It's just like also with Cain and Abel. If we go down right here, just a little ways from the account in Genesis 3, it says in verse 4 of chapter 4, as for Abel, he brought some of the firstlings of his flock, even their fatty pieces. Now, while Jehovah was looking with favor upon Abel and his offering, he did not look with any favor upon Cain and his offering. And Cain grew hot with great anger, and his countenance began to fall. Did Cain sin right here? Excuse me. Well, there really wasn't any law against getting angry, was there? Although he had inherited and developed at this point the knowledge of good and bad, because Adam and Eve took that and passed it on to all of us. That's why we know and why we do things like wear clothes, just like they did way back then, because like we all know, we feel insecure about it. And it's something that shows our awareness of things and the lingering effect of one of those things that's described for us in this original sin account. All right, so you might argue that Cain knew he shouldn't get angry because he had the knowledge of good and bad, and so in one sense it was a sin for him, similar to how if we think about a woman in our heart sexually inappropriately, it's a sin for us, according to Jesus. We can't really help that, right? That's the result of knowing good and bad. We're not going to be able to escape reacting to it in a way we can we could be either through our thoughts or our emotions held accountable, whether it's like Jesus said or like we read right here. Now, if you look, the account goes on and says, why are you hot with anger? Jehovah says to Cain, if you turn to doing good, right, there'll be an exaltation. But if you do not turn to doing good, there is sin crouching at the entrance, and for you is its craving, and for you, your part where you get mastery over it. Right? So sin is crouching at the entrance. It's almost like he's about to do the sin. The part that he'll be held accountable for. The part that even though it's wrong, right? The knowledge of good and bad, if we were taught by Yahuwah before partaking of the tree, and we learn how to properly make use of our knowledge and awareness of what's right and wrong, and I believe later then once we reached a point, we would have been allowed to eat from that tree, and it would have advanced our awareness beyond the point that we had demonstrated to be able to eat from it. But that's not something I can prove. I just, based on the fact that the tree is there and that we were told one thing that was wrong. So we had some knowledge of right and wrong without eating from the tree. Just one thing, what Jah told Adam and Eve not to do, and the things he told them to do. So they knew what was right and they knew what was wrong only in that one regard. I believe Yahuwah would have continued to tell them what was right and wrong up until the point where it would have been appropriate for them to eat both from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad and the tree of life, which is why they were both there. Because it seems to me, based as I just said, that reasoning, that once we had reached the point where Jah had trained us properly and we had shown responsiveness correctly, we would have been allowed to do so. That's why I believe we're allowed to do so if we are in the garden of God that Jesus talks about in Revelation. Or those even in the new earth, right? They eat from the leaves of the trees. And then those in the garden of God with Jesus eat from the fruit of the trees. So if that's the case later, then probably that was going to be the case before. We just didn't get to that point because before we were ready, we were influenced by you-know-who, and we weren't able to properly handle that. But our choices were still counted against us. My point in really bringing up this account, though, is to not only discuss that, because I think it's important for us to have this broader understanding of sin and the account and how all this relates together and goes back to that. Really, the sin, right? Even though he's going against, he's not making the right decision in terms of his anger, right? So he's not properly managing his knowledge of good and bad in that respect. But really, the account shows the sin doesn't occur until Cain actually murders his brother. The way it's described here, it seems to me at least that Jah is saying you have an opportunity here to avoid this. You can pull back right now on your emotions, get them in control, don't murder your brother, and this won't then be something that so easily spreads among the human family right from the beginning, right? And so there Cain had the option to act on or not act on what he felt like doing. In a similar way, moving forward to our account, our key account, there are a couple others and we might get to one or more of them, but this is our main one that I think is going to really help us to answer this question from a Christian perspective. Can Christians be LGBTQ? Lesbian, gay, meaning primarily, or in this case, male homosexual, bisexual, transgender, meaning you don't identify with your biological gender, or queer, which, at least for me, for the most part, means basically the same thing as homosexual or non-heterosexual. There may be some other meanings for some of these terms, But more or less, and for the most part, I believe that what I have said in relation to those terms, the LGBTQ acronym, is correct. Let's take a look at 1 Corinthians 6. And we're going to read our, the key verses are verses 9 through 11, but let's look at this in a little bit broader context so we can really appreciate it, okay? And now remember what I just described in the Genesis account, what we talked about, and what the text says, okay? Because we need to be able to answer this question, heteros. We need to be able to answer this question. All right, if we can get the homos, the LGBTQ people, and homos in particular, I think most of us have, in large part, encounter male homosexuals, lesbians. I've met a few transgender people, but not many, although they seem to be increasing, or at least they're in the public eye far more than they used to be, right? For the most part, a lot of us are encountering bisexual, lesbian, and gay men. I'm not going to get into the issue of pedophilia really tonight. And that's not part of the acronym LGBTQ. And it is a separate issue, although there's some interrelationship. Like I said, the term that you're going to see used here in verse 9, pornos, it's not porneia. That's used in another text some of you are familiar with and that we'll take a quick look at in Galatians. Pornos can include pedophilia. I'll show you that in just a moment, and then I'll talk about it in an extended detail in another show. All right, we're going to read verses 1 through 20, okay? And then we're going to answer this question. Can Christians be LGBTQ? I believe at this account, and any other account, but this account in particular, can be effectively used to answer this question and is consistent with what we just read in the book of Genesis. Here we go. Verse 1. Does any one of you that has a case against the other dare to go to court before unrighteous men and not before the holy ones? Verse 2. Or do you not know that the holy ones will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you unfit to try very trivial matters? Verse 3, do you not know that we shall judge angels? Why then not matters of this life? Verse 4, if then you do have matters of this life to be tried, is it the men looked down upon in the congregation that you put in as judges? In other words, is this why you're having problems resolving these issues and you have to go to court before non-Christians, right? You didn't put the right men in the position to be able to determine, right? And we could also say women, right? We do have examples in the Bible of some women judges, right? Deborah. And women, based on how they actually manifest their faith, can be accepted in various roles and ways that, while not maybe common to them, are nonetheless appropriate for the particular woman's demonstration of abilities consistent with what we read in Christian accounts for men, right? Of course, any woman who in any way does so would then be just as subject as men to subject yourselves to men, because we're subjected to the Christ, and that's not a burden. Being subject to other Christian men is not in any way meant to make you feel inferior or abused. You simply should feel confident. Right? Just like he's saying right here, who's there? Right? If you don't have the right people, well, that's a different question, isn't it? If you have the right people, well, then it really won't be an issue. You'll just be acting in the ways that we see reflected in these texts. We see women greeted by Paul, by John. We see women referenced in the letter by Pliny to Trajan, and how they were very much involved in terms of organizing the early morning meetings of the Christians, providing a place for such things to happen, being executed for their faith and not rejecting the Messiah. So that does not, nonetheless, that doesn't mean that we just start appointing women or women who are not qualified, just all of a sudden start assuming male roles, right? If you're really faithful, if you're really the type of Christian that we're talking about, that you understand what men are going through, or at least you're trying to in the ways that you can help. And then we help you, and then we all work together like a body. Who's the head? Depends on who we're talking about, right? Everybody has a head but God. So we should be able to work things out. Moving past that, though, right? That doesn't directly address the issue. Although, it does tie into whether or not we are prepared to decide on these matters, right? Can we answer this question, right? Can we answer decisively to the satisfaction of everybody, at least Christians, right? Homo and non-homo, non-LGBTQ and LGBTQ people who claim to be Christian. Can we at least all agree, right? Non-Christians who are either hetero or LGBTQ, we don't necessarily have to agree on whether Christians can be LGBTQ, but it's important for us to have an understanding of this as Christians, or those who claim to be, whether LGBTQ or plus, because we're making it look bad. We're not honoring the Christ by being divided over this issue. And I don't think we need to be divided. I think LGBTQ people need to start being more open and honest and careful about what you're doing in entertainment, in media, and the influence that you're using toward people who may not really want to be involved in that lifestyle if you were open and honest about what is involved. I think if you were at least honest and open, you said, look, yes, we're LGBTQ. We understand we practice forms of sex or have relationships that are not consistent with what the Bible says, but we're sinners. We're trying to manage it and not do the things we know are not right, that are sinful. But sometimes it's hard for us. And just like with you heteros, who sometimes have sex in ways that are spoken of against, or people who act greedy, not just think greedily, but actually steal, or maybe people who lie or murder, and then like they feel bad, right? There's going to be consequences specific to these different actions socially. So, right, even if you can be forgiven for being a murderer, if you murdered someone and then you realized that was wrong, or you started to repent and you confessed and you accepted your punishment and you didn't try to justify the action, then you would be accepted as a Christian, right? You would still be punished for the social wrong you committed, right? For doing something that's against society. There are penalties that would apply, and it's also a sin, like Cain and Abel that we read earlier. So you would be subject to death, ultimately, at some point. But whether or not God chooses to give you life based on your repentance and faith in Jesus, or just your, as the Bible also talks about, you following the law of your heart and repenting and just feeling remorseful and refraining from killing people again, murdering people again, then that's different from someone who continues to intentionally murder people without repenting, is it not? Of course it is. You're still going to get consequences for the murders you did commit, but by not continuing to commit murders, right? I think at times hetero Christians in this case, we sometimes look at homos or LGBTQ people who may claim to be Christian, we think, well, how can you be a Christian, right? You're committing these sinful acts. Well, okay, but we're all sinful. We're all committing some of these acts at times to differing degrees. And some of us are definitely, right, like Joseph, we're able to get the mastery over it by far more so than we are not. And that's looked upon with favor by God in the Christ as not practicing vile things like Jesus talks about in John 5. We're even though sinful and subject to failing, we're still fighting against it and succeeding in large part, or at least at times. I think as hetero Christians, we fail to recognize homos, especially who claim to be Christian, and maybe just many who follow the law of their heart and who feel it's not quite right, but they still desire to do it. We don't think about the times they struggle with it, right? And maybe even at times don't do it. They may want to, and it may be someone they like, and in a situation that's conducive, but they just feel bad about it. And then sometimes maybe they give in and they commit the sin. We're not going to be able to know the full extent of people, whether homo, LGBTQ, or murderers, thieves, greedy persons. We're going to read about it in just a second. We're not going to know everybody. We're not going to be able to tell the things we'll need to be able to tell, the times when they fought, the times when they gave in, the times when they succeeded, that only the Father and the Son can do. The ones who are properly capable of judging our heart and our mind and our actions. Now, okay, so we can't control that. We can't have that kind of final, other than the unforgivable sin, right? Remember earlier I gave off example. I said, is this the unforgivable sin? Is adultery the unforgivable sin? Is fornication? We start talking about what fornication is. Is stealing the unforgivable sin? What's the unforgivable sin? It's blaspheming the Holy Spirit, right? That's it. So unless something manifestly falls into that category, it's not unforgivable. We have a whole account, for example, regarding adultery in John 8, where Jesus turns it around on everybody, right? A woman brought to him, and then they let her go because of their sin. All right, so we need to be careful that we're not putting LGBTQ people in a special category of sin, unless what they're doing is openly blaspheming the Holy Spirit, right? And so that could involve some type of openly anti-Christian ritual. But then again, we're talking mostly about LGBTQ people who would want to be considered Christian, with an eye towards LGBTQ people who aren't Christian, so they understand kind of where we're coming from. But we need to be able to have a position on this issue as Christians, right? Because otherwise they're just going to keep calling us hateful and projecting their hate on us, and we'll make no progress, right? And this is another thing, homos, you often, LGBTQ people, talk about being progressive, right? It's like sometimes, it's very frequent actually, that you'll hear how, even Chris Evans at Captain America, the Marvel movies, recently came out against people who were not pro-LGBTQ and said, I think it was the Buzz Lightyear movie regarding that heteros basically, or people who think like that, are like dinosaurs who are going to be extinct, right? So we have this enmity. We have this kind of inability to properly understand each other in ways that I think have led to conflict, even hatred, and right, we can't even take a position, like we don't support certain sexual acts that are presented in movies we don't want to subject our kids to, without certain pro-LGBTQ people saying we're going to die like dinosaurs. LGBTQ people, that's not very loving. That sounds kind of hateful. Did you tell Chris Evans he was being hateful by saying that people who didn't want their children in a Pixar Disney animated movie to be subject to sexual scenes that aren't what we take them to those movies for, and aren't what we want our kids learning through movies like that, or even at that age, depending on which parent and what the age of the child is. No, I don't know of any homos that address Chris Evans and said you're being hateful, right? What if, hey, LGBTQ people, what if we said, you know what, all of you who don't like what our version of Star Wars is, you guys are all going to die soon anyway. You're like extinct dinosaurs. You're all going to be dead soon anyway, so who cares, right? I think that would have generated the hateful, and that would have been probably accurate in some way, but the hateful remark would have come out. Maybe not so much as a projection, because again, that's kind of hateful, right? So you guys can do it, or people who are pro-LGBTQ can do it. And when it really is hateful, right? You're basically saying we're going to die off when all we're doing is supporting what is biologically normative. So, and saying we don't want to take our kids to a kids movie about what's not normative. See, it's not right, LGBTQ people. You're not, these kind of things wouldn't happen if you were being honest. If Chris Evans was being faced with the facts that are the case with LGBTQ relationships, whether it's being some of the fastest ending relationships like lesbians, or all of the physical abuse that is involved or results from male homo relationships and others, but males in particular, like we've been talking about. I don't think so, right? I think if Chris Evans were fully informed, right? And it's hard to believe he's not, right? But he's not. He's not being made aware, or, you know, it's funny when you don't hear people like me talking about it like this. It's just so easy not to think about what's really going on and then just look at it like, well, so what, right? Well, so what? There's a lot that's happening with these forms of sex and relationships. And in our case this evening, the question we want to answer is all that's going on with LGBTQ relationships, is that can you be a Christian and have that going on? Well, we've been talking about how the fact is it's not none of it is an unforgivable sin according to the Bible, at least not described explicitly like that. And in the Bible, it's very clear that we all sin to some extent. Some of us fight against it, others give into it. And there's a difference between desiring something and actually doing it. And while desiring it may not be something that's good, right? It still shows we're not managing the knowledge of good and bad, right? Like Cain didn't when he got angry. It's still not held against us as a sin if we don't do it. We don't actually do the act. So, while it may be in some sense, even based on the violating our knowledge of good and bad, in the physical sense, right? People don't hold us accountable when we think about doing something. Whether it's stealing, whether it's being greedy, right? Whether it's thinking about someone else's wife, right? It's not something to get too worried about unless it's really made clear to us this is what's happening. You know what I'm saying? It's when it really happens. Or, yeah, again, if someone is aware that you're thinking about, for example, stealing from their house, they'll be more aware and try to prevent you. But outside of that, if you're just having the momentary thought, it's not something people are going to necessarily react to. It's not seen as the same thing as doing it. It wasn't even seen that way in the Genesis account involving Cain and Abel. Right now, so we've been reading 1 Corinthians 6, and we've been talking about a few things in the context. We're going to get now to the real descriptions of things that are viewed as sin. And so here's where he gets to it, right? He says it's a defeat for them if they have lawsuits with one another. We're going to kind of skip past that a little, but just because I don't want to get too much off of that on that again, although we did kind of address the issue of, you know, making sure we have the right people doing the right things, or just if you feel like doing something, then just start doing it. That's the best way to be what you want to be. And then people can respond to you and decide whether or not they trust you. To the contrary, you are wrong and defraud and your brothers at that, right? And so I wanted to read that because it's right after that. He says, what? In verse 9, do you not know that righteous persons will not inherit God's kingdom? Right? So that's kind of connected with wronging and defrauding people, right? Excuse me. And then he adds more things to it in addition to wronging and defrauding people. He says, do not be misled. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men kept for natural purposes, nor men who lie with men. I can hear my cat scratching my couch. Stop that. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Sorry about that. He's scratching him. I'm hearing the sound. Nor men kept for natural purposes, nor men who lie with men. Verse 10, nor thieves, nor greedy persons. Remember I said we would see that. Most of you knew it was already there. Nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners will inherit God's kingdom. If that is what some of you were, been washed clean, been sanctified, you've been declared righteous in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ with the Spirit of our God. We'll just stop it there. Right? So, pretty much right here, right, he talks about, again, people who wrong and defraud others. And then we get into the other items that are also something to be concerned about and that would disqualify you from inheriting God's kingdom. He talks about fornicators. Right? Now in verse 9, the word for fornicators is a form of pornos. Okay? Which is a noun. And I'll just read briefly out of the definition for pornos or parnos from the Liddell Scott Classical Greek Dictionary, but which also includes definitions from texts from the Septuagint and from the New Testament. On page 1450, parnos is defined as catamite, which is like a pedophile, a boy lover. Sodomite, right, which is again abusive sexual people or practice, inclusive of anal. And fornicator, idolater. And as I'm going to show in a separate video, and as you're going to see in a moment too, and even from that definition, right, it includes pedo, boy lover, which is anal, right, anal with a child. Sodomy, which is inclusive of anal with male or female. And then fornication, right? So as you're going to see when we get to Galatians 5, right, there isn't always the same description that makes it very clear that we're talking, for example, about male homosexuality, men who lie with men, right? For example, in Galatians 5, it just refers to fornication, like porneia in that case, which is like prostitution. Whatever would be appropriate to a prostitute, right? So a variety of sexual acts, but for in a prostitution sense, whatever would happen in association with a prostitute. And so that could include anal as well, and often did, right? So, and does. So fornication is not exclusive. In fact, it's very much inclusive of anal, whether it's with a male boy or male and adult male, or male and adult female, right? Sodomy. Or something you would do with a prostitute, which could also include anal or homosexuality, different types of acts, but mainly that, right? But also could be two women who don't do the anal act. Either way, right? So I'll get into that more later, but just briefly, I'll also read porneia from Liddell Scott, same page, 1450. Prostitution, fornication, unchastity, right? And then a variety of terms related to it that involve prostitution or what happens at a brothel, right? But number one definition, prostitution. So Fornication has often come to mean today just having sex before you're married, right? That's not what it meant in the ancient world. Now, it could mean that, though, right? Because when you have sex with a prostitute, that's essentially what it is. But then we get into the whole question of what would constitute being married in the ancient world. And of course, we know in the Christian sense, you're not supposed to leave your wife for anybody. I talked about this a little bit in my polygamy video. So we'll talk about porneia and pornos and other terms in a separate video. I wanted to share that here so you understood what was involved in fornicators, right? I've already talked about what adultery is in my polygamy video. We will talk about these terms again in my forthcoming video on these terms and related terms. Right? We're not gonna get into every single what everything might mean here, but you could understand. Depends on what you understand the terms to mean when it comes to kept for unnatural purposes. Right? So we could look at a couple different translations if we wanted to. Some say, for example, the American Standard say not effeminate. King James, nor effeminate. New American Bible, nor boy prostitutes. Right? But that's in addition to their translation of pornos as fornicators. And that's separate also from practicing homosexuality, which is the men who lie with men part. Let's see. New International, nor male prostitutes. New Jerusalem Bible, the self-indulgent, right? And the New World Translation, men kept for unnatural purposes. Young's literal, nor effeminate, right? So we'll talk about the meaning and proper translation of that phrase and description in particular in association with the other terms in another video. But we want to focus right here because this is where it really gets to the more explicit, even though I think the use of pornos, translated fornicators here, also includes anal and therefore by extension, any lifestyle or sexual act that would include anal as an abusive act covered by pornos or porneia. Either way, we don't have to really rely on that here because we have this explicit description here, right? Nor men who lie with men. And that's very explicit. So you get different translations, right? Like Young's literal, nor sodomites, NWT, right? Nor men who lie with men. New International Version, nor homosexual offenders. And the Greek is ute arsenokoitai. And it's a form of asenokoites, which is basically a homosexual. Right? If you look that up, you'll see that that's essentially what it means. A male homosexual. So here it says that such persons, people that do all these things, will not inherit God's kingdom. So that would seem to be like a real clear, for some people, answer to this whole question of can Christians be LGBTQ? Right? And yet it also clearly states in verse 11, that's what some of you were. Right? So they were doing some of these things. And that's not too hard to understand, right? Because again, what is it talking about? It also includes thieves, greed, drunkenness, right? When it says these descriptions, right, again, like we've been talking about in association with various accounts, it's talking more so about what? People that commit the act of what these things stand for. Do you think that what 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10 is talking about is explicitly for your thoughts? Like just thinking about stealing something? Do you think Paul is here saying, anyone who thinks about stealing, you're not going to inherit God's kingdom? Anyone who is greedy at any time, you're not going to inherit God's kingdom. Anyone who gets drunk at any time, you're not going to inherit God's kingdom. Anyone who reviles, anyone who extorts, you're not going to, you're done. It's over. And that would also include defrauding your brothers and wronging your brothers, right? There's a lot going on here in addition to these sexual practices that are abusive and damaging to people, right? This is abusive stuff, as we've been talking about. But, right, being a thief, being greedy, being drunk, these are not good or healthy for you either. Especially the drinking part, but being a thief or greedy person can get you killed in a second, right? Stealing from somebody, not very healthy either. But again, we have to ask ourselves the question, before we can answer the question of whether Christians can be LGBTQ, is thinking about the act to be considered the same as committing it. Apart from whether or not ultimately God and Jesus hold us accountable for example, how often we think about it and dwell on it, right? It's not a good thing, right? The accounts show that they knew David was thinking about or observing Bathsheba, and ultimately it led to him committing that great sin. But even that, of course, it appears the way he's spoken about that, he's someone who committed a sin. He wasn't doing it all the time. The amount of times he didn't commit a sin like that seemed to be far more than the one time that is recorded where he committed such a great sin. So we don't often think about that, right? Can LGBTQ people who think about doing what those letters stand for, if you're a lesbian, can you be a Christian and think about or at times desire lesbian sexual relationships? You don't do it, or maybe at times you succumb and do it, but you feel bad, repent, and you go back to fighting against it, right? Like Paul, right? Does Paul not say that very thing? LGBTQ Christians, the thing I want to do is what I don't do. The thing that I shouldn't do is what I do, right? I'm fighting constantly against my flesh. You're not alone. None of us are immune to this, and we're all dealing with it, right? I'm a heterosexual. I love having sex with women. I don't go around, and I'm not in a position to where I can't control my desire to have sex with them, even if I have it. I can control it. For sure, most of the time, right? Even if I succumb, I'm not out there all the time or ever justifying failing in the ways that I would consider unacceptable. So, in the same way, when we look at LGBTQ people, right, in the same way, is there any difference between a heterosexual who commits a sexual sin as a Christian and who repents, may even commit it again, but who again has to struggle with it, gets consequences, right? You may get a disease, you may have anal issues. You're not going to avoid that, right? It's just what happens. It's Jaws. What you plan comes back. It's as simple as that. And by the fruits of what you plant, you'll know whether it's good. And LGBTQ people may find a lot of good, again, as I mentioned earlier, in the communal aspects that many of them have and that the community offers, whether it's jobs, whether it's association, whether it's just feeling better about yourself, like by being with other people. There's a lot of benefit to that. But ultimately, the costs are significant. They're enormous. And if you want to be more inclusive with us, right, do we have to be so divided on this issue? Can't we all agree that stealing is bad? And that sometimes people make a mistake circumstantially, or they're just weak, or they do something stupid and they apologize later and then try to make amends and they change their ways? Isn't that what Jesus says? You forgive your brother as long as he comes back, and the person who comes back, your sister or whoever, and they say, I'm going to change my ways, which means that they're sincere and there's evident demonstration, at least to some point, where they perhaps succumb again, depending on who they are and what they're dealing with and their circumstances. It's not all the same. The fact is, many of us have stolen. Many of us have been greedy. Many of us have been drunk. Many of us have reviled. Many of us have extorted. Many of us have been sexually abusive. Many of us have been venerating idols or idolatrous to some extent. But I would say those of us who claim to be Christian and who have done those things, or who may at times fail because of our sinful nature and do those things and then regret it, right? We feel bad, and that is evidence that shows we don't, like Cain, right, embrace the sin. And not just feel bad because of the consequences, right? Like Cain did. We feel bad because we did something we know was wrong or hurt somebody else and hurt ourselves as well, or a relationship, or even if it was what we desired was not good. Right? And we're talking about things, LGBTQ people, that whether or not you do them and can do them as a Christian, they're still not good. No one has provided me with anything that shows LGBTQ relationships or non-heterosexual involvement is better or even as good as the consequences and benefits that come from normal heterosexual sex and relationships. They're not even close. Heterosexual relationships can provide children, can provide the physiological, anatomical, and you can show emotional complements to each other without physical, emotional, or other type of abuse. I'm not saying all heterosexual relationships are perfect. You still have to treat each other well. That's not what we're discussing when it comes to this issue. We're talking about whether or not the act, or whether, in this case, LGBTQ people are being honest about the significance of the acts involved in their relationships, and the fact that pretty much they're entirely negative in terms of their consequences, physiologically, emotionally, spiritually, I would argue. And the evidence is there to support that. The studies that show the consequences of the, for example, anal abuse or lesbian sexual abuse, the consequences of the emotional and mental effects on the homosexual community, whether it's the increased drug use, meth in particular, whether it's suicide rates. Again, some of these things can be argued based on various reasons, but they still point to negative consequences you don't find as resultative of in heterosexual relationships, right? They may happen, but they're not necessarily resulting from them. The way physical, and I would argue mental, emotional, and even spiritual abuse can be shown to be resulting from these LGBTQ relationships. We're not really focusing a lot on transgender, which is really the only other different one, right? Because you have the bisexual, but really the only part about the bisexual would be the same part that's applicable to the homo or gay or lesbian homosexual elements that we've been discussing, and then the queer is basically the same. So the transgender is also something that involves a lot of these same types of conditions. It's just you're approaching it more from an identity perspective than you are from your desire, right? Because in the transgender case, you're basically saying you identify consistent with your desire. You're just not physiologically, or the gender assigned physiologically or at birth, you're just not in alignment with that, right? That's why transgenders go through gender reassignment surgery, or dress or look like the opposite gender. They identify more with that than with the anatomy that they were born with that is common to the other gender. Right? So, but nonetheless, it ultimately involves the transgender person using their body in a way that isn't consistent with how they were born or made or designed. They'll just say they identify with the other gender no matter how they were born or designed. But transgender people, how can you identify with something that you never have been? If you were never born a male, how can you identify with being a male? The things that males identify with are based on how our physiology, our anatomy, what we have. Which then goes into the personality we possess, right? The physiological structure, our hormones, our organs that produce the level of hormones that we possess. So if you're a man transgender person, right, you're biologically a man, but you identify as a woman, how can you identify as a woman? You were never a woman. What are you identifying with? You're just identifying with what you're seeing on other people and the influences they're having on you. You can't identify with it. You don't have anything that identifies with the male the way males identify with ourselves. You're just identifying with other people, females in this case, in a way that for some reason you desire to reflect more so than what your physiology would suggest. But you can't identify with being a female. You don't have a vagina. How are you going to identify with a full woman who has to go through actual cycles, right? Menstrual cycles. You can't identify with that. You don't go through it. You never did. So I just think the whole transgender thing is more of a mental issue. Maybe some other things, but I don't understand where you're getting your identity from if you were never in the first place the thing you identify with in any way that would be consistent with how the people who are actually physiologically and otherwise identified as that thing identify. So, but again, we get back to a lot of these same questions. And I think a lot of the same issues ultimately can be resolved in the same way. Right? Are you LGBTQ people being open and honest with yourselves and other people, or are you lying? Are you deliberately concealing the truth or distorting the truth or just lying about the facts so people don't think less about your practice? The fact that it involves anal abuse, the mixing of fecal matter, semen, blood, regular anal tearing, lesions, anal warts, increased disease, right? I mean, let's be honest. Are we being honest? I'm being factual. Am I being factual by saying an anal rupturer? Yes. Does it sound pleasant? No. Did anything I just say sound pleasant? No. Well, if you call me a Jesus-loving Christian, depending on how you say it, it may not sound pleasant. But it's true, isn't it? I am a Jesus-loving Christian. So when you say it, you just mean to identify with the people who, like you, don't love Jesus the way I do, if you're a non-Jesus lover. So in one sense, it could be viewed as negative coming from a person who's not the thing that they're referencing me as being in association with lover, but it's actually factually true in a way you just don't agree with me about. And so the significance about what you're factually saying as true is different. Right? I actually would, under most circumstances, accept Jesus-loving Christian, right? But based on the way you say it, I know you mean it in a way that separates us from who we are. In the same way, anal rupturing homo is factually true. And it makes clear who I'm talking about, because really, like we've been seeing all throughout this evening, right? And as even your acronym LGBTQ shows, there really is no clear reference to anal homos or male homos who practice primarily anal sex, even though that could also apply again to bisexual people, even some heterosexuals and lesbos. But it's primarily, as I said in my We Need to Talk About This Homos video, a male homo thing, a male gay thing. And so it has to be discussed. If we can't resolve this issue, well, then why go on to anything else, right? This is something that I think we can all agree upon. The LGBTQ community needs to be more honest about, more transparent about. You can still practice what you desire to be if that's what you want. Now, if you're a Christian LGBTQ, it's a little different, isn't it? Can you just practice anything you want? No, I'm a heterosexual. Can I just go out and have sex with whoever I want, no matter what? And just go from woman to woman, right? No, I can't do that. So I cannot follow through with what on a fundamental level based on my biology is part of my desire. I don't cultivate that desire, and so it doesn't like get the better of me in any way, but it's certainly consistent with my biology, right? To want to have sex with as many women as possible. So it's only if I do it, right, in the ways that would be abandoning the other women and just lead to this ongoing, adultery in ways that are against the Bible. So, but you can make a mistake, right? We've talked about it. These are not none of these are unforgivable sins. You don't inherit them when you practice them and lie about them to people, and you're obviously not even trying to show the kind of control that Paul talked about that was very difficult and at times leads to sin. We're not going to win every battle, but we should be able to, if we're Christian, win most or many, or at least be struggling, right? Because the things we're struggling not to do, LGBTQ people, are good for us. It's not good for you statistically and evidentiary, right? Scientifically. There's increased problems emotionally. Lesbians are the fastest breaking up relationship. There's increased problems with lice, all kinds of stuff. There's no advantage. The things that, like here, when it says men lie with men, right? Porneia, pornos, these abusive practices, pedo, homo. These aren't things that by not doing are going to hurt you. Not doing these things are going to make you live, on average, 2 decades longer, have a lot less disease, have far more properly functioning anal capacity, and have healthier relationships. It's the same with thievery, being greedy, getting drunk, having abusive heterosexual relationships, which is inclusive of pornos, right? Because that can also apply to what is appropriate for a prostitute. So I don't see any reason why, as Christians, we should differentiate between homosexuals, LGBTQ people, and heterosexuals when it comes to whether we can be Christians, as long as we're being honest. We're told to confess our sins and to admit when we make mistakes. And that's it. We're forgiven. Even in Matthew 18, right? What does Jesus say? If you have something against someone, go to that person and see if he listens. And if he doesn't listen, or he or she doesn't listen, you go and you take another person. If they don't listen to you too, take the whole congregation of Christians there. Right? And if it's an issue that you can see is evidentially true and the person's denying it, well, why would you want to hang around that person anymore anyway? They're just lying to you. They're not being honest with you or with anybody else. Right? You treat them as a person of the nations. You have business with them. You say hi and bye, whatever you have to do, whatever you do with a person of the nations, and you don't bring them into your intimate Christian association. They're lying. Well, if you LGBTQ people who claim to be Christian are also lying, you're not being honest with people about what's involved. You're just claiming that homo relationships, for example, are just like hetero, and we're all sinful. And so, yeah, but not all hetero relationships are sinful. And all homo relationships are abusive to one degree or another. The statistics and scientific data does not lie. And so, if there's nothing beneficial that comes from it, physiological, mental, or spiritual. Right? You may have some contentment. There may be some productive homosexual relationships, and I have seen some. I mean, you can be happy, especially if you have a condition where really, again, heteros, we can't fully understand the thinking of everybody, so let's not try to. We do need to be accommodating, and as long as a person is not lying to us about what their relationship or activity, if they succumb to it, involves, or what they desire but they try to fight against, we need to be more understanding. We're not so different. We are and we aren't, right? We're practicing different things at times and sinning in different ways, and some of them have greater or lesser consequences. But the unforgivable sin, blaspheming the Holy Spirit, is the only one that should divide us when it comes to the question of being a Christian. And as long as we're not lying to people about what we do, or at sometimes we desire or sometimes succumb to, we need to be accommodating. We need to be forgiving, because the judgment we render out to others, Matthew 7, is the judgment we will be receiving.